Hello everyone. In this video, I'll be talking about Azure Firewall, its different types, their features, and the pricing difference among them. So let's start. Azure Firewall is a cloud native network security service that provides a solid threat protection for Azure workloads. It is a fully stateful firewall which has built-in high availability and scalability, which means you don't need to configure the high availability during the deployment, and it's infinitely scalable during the operation of Azure Firewall. Azure Firewall also provides traffic inspection for east-west as well as north-south traffic, where the east-west traffic means the internal traffic which is within your organization, and the north-south traffic means the traffic which goes out of your organization to the internet or comes from the internet. There are three options available during the deployment of Azure Firewall: basic, standard, and premium. And in this video, I'll talk about all these three options and their feature so that it will be easy for you to decide which one to use during the deployment in your environment. I'll start with Azure Firewall Basic. It is most suited for small and medium-sized businesses which are looking for cost-effective security for their Azure cloud environment in an affordable price range. The slide on your screen mentions the different features which are provided by Azure Firewall Basic. So let's discuss in detail one by one. First one is built-in high availability. This means you don't need an additional load balancer to configure the availability in Azure Firewall Basic. Multiple instances of the Azure Firewall will be deployed by Microsoft in the backend, and in that specific availability zone or the region, Azure Firewall Basic will be available. Now let's move on to availability zones. Firewall Basic also supports multiple availability zones for enhanced availability, and there is no extra cost for deploying your firewall in different availability zones. The only thing you need to consider is whether the specific regions support availability zones or not, because not all the regions of Azure supports availability zone. Another feature is application FQDN filtering rules. FQDN is fully qualified domain name here. Azure Firewall Basic can restrict the outbound HTTP or HTTPS traffic based on the fully qualified domain names of the sites or the domain, where you can even use the wildcard to include all the subdomains. By using this feature in application rule, you can filter the outbound traffic to specific websites. For example, if you want to allow the web search of Google, then you can allow google.com. But if you want to allow all the websites like news.google.com, mail.google.com, in that case, you can just use the wildcard and all the different sites which are related to the domain google.com will be allowed. Another feature is network traffic filtering rules. Using the network traffic rules in the Azure Firewall Basic, you can centralize the creation of allow and deny rules across the multiple subscription and virtual network in your environment. These rules are defined by source and destination IP addresses, port, and the protocol, which filters the traffic at layer 3 and layer 4, which are OSI layer, network layer, and the transport layer. And this is the same way like you configure the network security group, NSGs, while creating the NIC card. Before proceeding with the other features, let's discuss the different Azure Firewall rules. As you can see on your screen, there are 4 different rules which are available in Azure Firewall, which are network rule, application rule, NAT rule, and threat intelligence rule. So as we have already discussed network rule, where the traffic is controlled based on the source IP address, destination IP address, port, and protocol. However, in the case of the application rule, you can allow or deny the traffic based on fully qualified domain name of the website. And you can also use the wildcard names for allowing or denying the access to the subdomain of that specific website. In the NAT rule, which is Network Address Translation rule, you can map the private IP address to the specific public IP address of Azure Firewall, which means if the traffic is coming to Azure Firewall public IP address, it will be redirected towards the private IPs defined in the rule. And it works vice versa too. So using the NAT rule, you can configure the source and destination NATing. And the last rule is threat intelligence rule, where the Azure Firewall blocks or report the traffic from the malicious IP addresses or the domain. However, in the case of Azure Firewall Basic, it only reports, while Azure Firewall Standard and Premium can deny the malicious IP addresses or domain. The only change which you have to do is enable the deny option in threat intelligence. And all these malicious IP addresses and domain are derived from threat intelligence of Microsoft. Let me show all these rules in Azure portal. So I'm in Azure portal now. If we'll go to the firewalls, it goes into Azure Firewall Manager, where in the security you can see the Azure Firewall. I have already created Azure Firewall because in another video I'll show the demo of the deployment of Azure Firewall. It is a basic Azure Firewall which is deployed in subnet Azure Firewall subnet, which is a dedicated subnet for Azure Firewall, and it has a public IP address defined. So if we'll go to the Azure Firewall policy, we were discussing the different rules, which are network rules, application rule, DNAT rule, and threat intelligence rule. So let's start with the network rule. I have created a network rule between virtual machine 1 and virtual machine 2. So that means VM1 should be able to RDP into VM2. The source IP address of the virtual machine is defined. The port is 3389, which is RDP port. Protocol is TCP, and the destination IP address, which is the virtual machine 2 IP address. So this is how you define the network rule. Let's go to the application rule now. In this application rule, I have allowed the Google to all the virtual network in this environment. As you can see, the source is star, the protocol is HTTP or HTTPS, and instead of providing the google.com, I have used the wildcard, which means not only google.com will be allowed, but its related domains like mail.google.com or news.google.com will also be allowed. And if we'll go to the DNAT rule, there is one DNAT rule created which allows the RDP to VM1 from the internet. So the source is star, which means the internet, port is 7070, protocol is TCP, and destination is the firewall public IP address. Translated address is the virtual machine 1 IP address, and the translated port is 3389, which means if someone will try to reach to public IP address of Azure Firewall on port 7070, it will be redirected towards the virtual machine 1. And without even knowing the private IP address of the virtual machine, the user or the application sitting in the internet can RDP into virtual machine 1 through Azure Firewall public IP. So this is how you can create the DNAT rules. The last one is threat intelligence rule. As you can see, there are multiple options of disable, alert only, and alert and deny. But alert and deny is disabled here. The reason is because it's Azure Firewall Basic and it's only available for standard and premium Azure Firewall policies. So all the traffic will be inspected through the threat intelligence of Microsoft, and if Microsoft detects something malicious, you will be alerted in this case. But in case of the standard and premium, those IP addresses or the domain will be blocked. You can even define the allow list IP addresses and the fully qualified domain name so that the defined IP addresses or fully qualified domain name will not be inspected. There are other features of the Azure Firewall policy which we'll discuss in the further videos. So let's go back to the slide where we're discussing the features of Azure Firewall Basic. We have already covered till network traffic filtering rules. So the next one is FQDN tags. In Azure Firewall Basic, you can allow the well-known network traffic through the firewall using the FQDN tags, which are fully qualified domain name tags. For example, for the Windows update, you can use the Windows update tag to allow the traffic for the updation of the Windows. And if you want to use the Azure Backup, you can use Azure Backup tags in the application rules of the Azure Firewall. Another feature is service tags. Service tags define the list of IP addresses which are predefined by Microsoft for the specific services like app services, API management services, or Active Directory service. So you can use these service tags while creating the network rule and allow the traffic towards that specific service. This makes it easy for you to create a rule as you don't need to mention the IP address of that service, which eases the creation and the management of the firewall rules. Another feature is threat intelligence. We have already discussed this during the rule section. Just to summarize, you can enable the threat intelligence based filtering on Azure Firewall Basic to alert if the traffic is coming from unknown malicious IP addresses or domain, And these IP addresses and domain are provided by Microsoft Threat Intelligence feed. We have already discussed the network address translation also. So another feature is outbound SNAT support, which is SourceNet. Using this feature, you can translate all the outbound virtual network traffic IP address to the Azure Firewall public IP address. So that means your internal IP address will not be visible to the outside world, and the outside application will just see that the traffic is coming from the Azure Firewall public IP address. And this is opposite in the case of inbound DNAT support. Using this feature, you can set up the destination network address translation for the specific public IP address of the Azure Firewall towards the private IP address of the virtual network. So that means if the traffic coming from the internet will hit that public IP address, it will immediately be redirected towards the private IP address. And you can use this feature to do RDP into your private servers through Azure Firewall from the internet. Multiple public IP addresses. As the heading clearly states that Azure Firewall Basic supports multiple IP addresses, which means you will have the multiple IP addresses assigned to the Azure Firewall, which can be used for DNAT support. Next feature is Azure Monitoring and Logging. Firewall Basic supports firewall logging, which means all the traffic or the filtering which is happening at the firewall can be easily monitored using the Azure Monitor. And you can even archive the logs to storage account and stream events to Event Hub. And if you want to add an automation, you can even trigger an automation based on specific event from your logs. And the last one is certification, because Azure Firewall is a fully managed service and it has multiple compliance certificates like PCI compliant, which is payment card industry, SOC service organization control, and ISO, International Organization for Standardization. And these are most famous ones. However, there are more you can find in the documentation for Azure Firewall. Now let's move on to Azure Firewall standard features. All the features which are available for Azure Firewall Basic are already included in standard SKU, and there are some extra features which you can see on your screen, and I'll be discussing them one by one. So the first one is unrestricted cloud scalability. So based on the changing network flow, Azure Firewall standard can scale out as by the demand. So you don't need to plan the scalability during the peak traffic. Another feature is DNS proxy. When the DNS proxy is enabled in Azure Firewall standard, it can process and forward the DNS queries from virtual network to the required DNS server, and this functionality helps in providing the reliable FQD and filtering in network rules. This feature can be enabled in your Azure Firewall standard as well as the firewall policy settings. Custom DNS. Azure Firewall standard supports the use of the custom DNS, which means you can configure the Azure Firewall standard to use the custom DNS server, which ensures that the outbound dependencies are resolved using the required DNS server. Even the multiple DNS server can be configured in Azure Firewall and Azure Firewall policies. Azure Firewall standard can also resolve the name using the Azure Private DNS. The only condition is that the virtual network must be linked to the Azure Private Zone. Next feature is deploy Azure Firewall without IP addresses in forced tunnel mode. By default, Azure Firewall service requires public IP address for deployment. But in the case of the secure deployment, where the firewall public IP address need not to be exposed to the internet, in such cases, firewall can be deployed in the forced tunnel mode, where the management NIC card is created for its operation and the data path is configured without a public IP address. And the internet traffic will be forced to another firewall and can be completely blocked. To enable the forced tunnel mode, you need to reconfigure the existing firewall using stop-start facility, as it can't be configured at the runtime. And if you have heard about the secure hubs, which is a part of the virtual WAN, all the firewalls which are deployed in the secure hubs are always deployed in forced tunnel mode. Forced tunneling. This feature is used when you want to route all the internet bound traffic to either any network appliance or on-prem. And in some cases, if you have intrusion detection or prevention system so that all the internet traffic goes through it. To enable this feature, you have to define the next hop in Azure Firewall configuration, and then all the internet traffic will be routed towards the other appliance. The last feature is web categories. Using the web categories in Azure Firewall, you can allow or deny the user access to different website categories such as gambling, social media. Web categories are already included in the Azure Firewall standard, but more fine-tuned version is available in the Azure Firewall Premium. For example, if you want to block google.com/news, then in Azure Firewall standard, it will be considered only google.com, which is a web search. However, in the case of Azure Firewall Premium, it will look for the news and it will consider that as a news category. And in the Azure Firewall, the categories can be organized based on different severities like liability, high bandwidth, business use, productivity loss, or even uncategorized. So that's all for Azure Firewall Standard. And let's move on to Azure Firewall Premium features. All the features which are available for Azure Firewall Basic and Azure Firewall Standard are included in the Azure Firewall Premium. And there are some extra features which you can see on your screen. So the first one is TLS inspection. TLS is transport layer security. TLS protocol primarily provides cryptography, which runs in the application layer and is widely used to encrypt the HTTP protocol. Azure Firewall Premium terminates and inspects TLS connection to detect, alert, and mitigate malicious activity in HTTPS. The firewall creates two dedicated TLS connections, one with the web server and the another one with the client. So if we'll talk about outbound TLS inspection, there are three types of TLS inspection: outbound TLS inspection, east-west TLS inspection, and inbound TLS inspection. For the case of the outbound, it protects against malicious traffic that is sent from the internal client hosted in Azure to the internet. In the case of east-west TLS inspection, it includes the traffic that goes from or to an on-prem network. So that means it's between on-prem to Azure. And to protect the Azure workloads from potential malicious traffic, east-west TLS inspection is used. And the last one is inbound TLS inspection. It is supported by Azure Web Application Firewall on Azure Application Gateway. Internal servers or application hosted in Azure from malicious requests that arrive from the internet or an external network. Application Gateway provides end-to-end encryption. However, in the case of Azure Firewall Premium, outbound TLS inspection as well as east-west TLS inspection is done. Because as already mentioned, inbound TLS inspection is mostly done by Azure Application Gateway along with Azure Web Application Firewall. IDPS, Intrusion Detection and Prevention System. Azure Firewall Premium provides signature-based intrusion detection and prevention system to allow rapid detection of attacks. The IDPS signature are available for both application and the network traffic, which are layer 3 to layer 7. And IDPS can be applied to inbound, spoke-to-spoke like east-west traffic and outbound traffic. These signatures are fully managed and continuously updated by Microsoft. However, there are some customization that can be done in the signature, like providing the private IP ranges so that they are ignored and bypass list where the inspection will not happen. And the last one is URL filtering. So URL filtering extends Azure Firewall FQDN or fully qualified domain name filtering capability to consider an entire URL. So as I've mentioned, google.com/news, so it will take care of the /news too. It can be applied both on HTTP as well as HTTPS traffic. And when the HTTPS traffic is inspected, Azure Firewall Premium can use its TLS inspection capability to decrypt the traffic and extract the target URL to validate whether access is permitted or not. So now we have discussed all the different features of different SKUs of Azure Firewall. In this slide, we'll discuss how to choose the right Azure Firewall SKU for your environment. So if we'll talk about the Azure Firewall Premium, it is recommended to secure highly sensitive applications such as payment processing. It supports advanced threat protection capabilities like malware and TLS inspection. In the case of Azure Firewall Standard, it is recommended for customers looking for layer 3 to layer 7 firewall and needs auto scaling to handle peak traffic, which is up to 30 Gbps. And it supports different features like threat intelligence, DNS proxy, custom DNS, and web categories. However, for the Azure Firewall Basic, it's mostly recommended for small and medium businesses where the throughput has to be below 250 Mbps. And to decide which type of firewall will suit your requirement, use the table on your screen. So as you can see, ease of management is available for all three, where the central management using the Azure Firewall Manager and the centralized Azure Firewall policy. In the case of reliability and performance, cloud scalability is one of the reasons which will help you decide SKU of the firewall you should use. If your traffic is up to 30 Gbps, then it's firewall standard. If it's 100 Gbps, then it's firewall premium. And in the case of the advanced threat protection, as we have already discussed, URL filtering, IDPS, and TLS inspection, all these features are available using Azure Firewall Premium. So every organization has different types of need for their environment. So have a look at this table and then decide which SKU of the firewall will fit your purpose. If you are still not able to decide which SKU of the Azure Firewall to use, then cost can be a major factor on your decision. On the next slide, as you can see, for the deployment itself, if the Azure Firewall Basic, Standard, and Premium are running, they will be charged per hour for the deployment. And if they are processing the data when the traffic is going through Azure Firewall, the charges are different for each type of the firewall. As we have discussed, when the Azure Firewall is deployed in virtual WAN, it is deployed in the forced tunneling mode. However, the charges are same whether you deploy Azure Firewall directly or you deploy in the virtual WAN in the secured virtual hub. The charges, as you can see, for the basic, standard, and premium are same. And not only the deployment charges, the data processing charges are also same. So using the previous feature table as well as this cost table, now you can decide which SKU of the Azure Firewall will fit your purpose. To summarize this video, we have discussed what is Azure Firewall, what are the different types of Azure Firewall and its SKUs, what are their features, what are the different firewall rules which can be set up in all these SKUs, and how can you choose which Azure Firewall SKU will suit your environment, and finally the pricing of Azure Firewall. That's all for this video. I hope you liked it. Please like and subscribe. Thank you.